U.S. Aviation crash investigators are in Monterey County, California tonight, trying to determine the cause of an accident that killed John Denver. The country rock singer died after the experimental plane he was piloting crashed into the Pacific just after takeoff.
For years, the mysterious circumstances surrounding John Denver's untimely death have sparked countless theories, speculations, and unresolved questions. The beloved singer-songwriter, known for his soaring vocals and iconic hits like Take Me Home, Country Roads, and Annie's Song, died in a plane crash off the coast of California in 1997. At the time, the official explanation pointed to pilot error and fuel mismanagement, but as time passed, new fragments of information emerged. Fragments that painted a picture far more complex and unsettling than initially believed. Now, decades later, the mystery has finally been solved, and the truth is nothing short of shocking. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. John Denver was flying a homemade Rutan Long EZ, an experimental aircraft known for its efficiency and sleek design. On October 12, 1997, Denver, a licensed pilot with significant flying experience, took off from Monterey Peninsula Airport and headed out over the Pacific. He was flying solo. Within minutes, he radioed air traffic control to report issues, then plummeted into the sea. His body was later recovered, and the world mourned a man whose music had touched millions. At the time, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board attributed the crash to Denver's inability to switch fuel tanks during flight, citing poor aircraft design and the location of the fuel selector valve as key factors. The case was closed, but the questions never really went away. Several aspects of the crash never sat right with aviation experts and even some members of Denver's inner circle. Denver was not only a skilled musician, but also an intelligent and curious man, known for his meticulous nature. He had logged over 2,700 flight hours and was very familiar with small aircraft. Many couldn't believe he would have taken off with insufficient fuel, or that he wouldn't have known how to manage the tanks. Even stranger was the aircraft itself. It wasn't just unusual, it was borderline experimental. Denver had purchased the plane shortly before the crash and hadn't had extensive time to become familiar with its idiosyncrasies. But even with that caveat, something didn't add up. Years passed, and the crash became yet another tragic footnote in the long list of celebrities lost too soon. But behind the scenes, investigators, both amateur and professional, continued probing the details. In recent years, access to previously sealed reports, private testimonies, and forensic data shed light on parts of the story that had been obscured. The narrative that had once seemed so straightforward began to fracture. A breakthrough came when a private aviation safety consultant named Marcus Ellery obtained access to internal documentation regarding the plane's previous owner. Buried in the records were troubling details about the aircraft's mechanical history. Prior to Denver acquiring it, the Long EZ had been involved in a series of minor accidents and repairs. Some of these incidents were never reported to federal aviation authorities, raising serious questions about the plane's airworthiness. Even more alarming was the revelation that an unauthorized modification had been made to the aircraft's fuel system. This wasn't just a technicality, it altered the way fuel was distributed and accessed, significantly increasing the complexity of managing fuel in flight. The selector valve that Denver would have needed to use to switch fuel tanks had been repositioned in such a way that it was nearly unreachable while flying. Worse, there were no clear markings or indicators to help a pilot unfamiliar with the modification understand the change. Denver's crash now looked less like pilot error and more like a catastrophic setup. But the true shock came from who made that modification and why. Ellery's continued investigation led him to a former mechanic who had worked on the Long EZ when it was still owned by the previous pilot. In a recorded interview, the mechanic admitted that several of the modifications made to the plane had been off the books and conducted under pressure from the owner, who wanted enhanced performance without dealing with federal inspections. This revelation, while troubling, still left open the question of why such a dangerously altered aircraft ended up in Denver's hands. Digging deeper, Ellery traced the plane's sail and found inconsistencies in the documentation. There were discrepancies in the sales paperwork and gaps in the aircraft's maintenance logbooks. When cross-referenced with FAA records, It appeared as though some entries had been forged or backdated. The truth was even more disturbing than negligence. Someone had intentionally concealed the condition of the plane prior to its sale. Eventually, the trail led to a shell company linked to the original owner of the aircraft. This company was used to facilitate the sale of the Long EZ to Denver without disclosing its full mechanical history. The motive? Financial gain and liability protection. The original owner was aware of the plane's dangerous modifications but didn't want to spend the money to undo them or risk being sued in the event of an accident. Selling the plane through a third party allowed them to walk away clean, at least until now. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. Denver, excited to fly a new aircraft and unaware of its hidden flaws, trusted the information provided to him. He took off with a machine that was not only difficult to fly, but fatally flawed. The relocated fuel valve was more than a poor design choice. It was a death trap. In his final moments, Denver likely realized the severity of the issue, but it was too late to do anything. This revelation casts a dark shadow over the tragedy. The story is no longer about a famous musician making a fatal mistake in the sky. It's about a calculated decision to pass off a defective aircraft to an unsuspecting buyer, with complete disregard for human life. Denver was failed not by his skills or judgment, but by a system that allowed critical safety information to be obscured behind bureaucracy and greed. What makes this discovery so chilling is that it could have been prevented. The aviation industry has strict regulations for a reason, but those safeguards only work when people follow them. In this case, loopholes and false documentation enabled the transaction. Even after the crash, key details were missed or ignored, allowing the mystery to fester for decades. The implications are enormous. It forces a reconsideration of how aviation investigations are conducted, especially when high-profile individuals are involved. Denver's celebrity status may have led investigators to rush toward a convenient conclusion, focusing on pilot error rather than probing deeper. It also opens the door to questions about how many other similar cases exist. How many crashes labeled as accidents were actually preventable tragedies rooted in deception or incompetence? For fans of John Denver, this revelation is bittersweet. On one hand, it removes the sting of believing their idol made a foolish or fatal error. It restores some dignity to his final moments, showing that he was trying to manage a crisis not of his own making. On the other hand, it's deeply upsetting to learn that his death was, in many ways, manufactured by a chain of decisions rooted in greed and carelessness. Denver's legacy has always been tied to nature, peace, and harmony. He was an environmentalist, a humanitarian, a dreamer. That such a man met his end not in a poetic act of fate but due to someone else's deception is heartbreaking. His voice, which once called for understanding and unity, now underscores a cautionary tale about the price of cutting corners. There's a certain tragedy in realizing how close he might have been to surviving, had even one of the safeguards worked as intended. If the aircraft's fuel system had not been altered, if the logbooks had been accurate, if the sale had undergone a more thorough inspection, Denver might still be here. These aren't just hypothetical musings, they are hard realities that demonstrate the ripple effects of neglect. Beyond the personal grief and public shock, this solved mystery serves as a glaring reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of accountability. It exposes the cracks in systems we assume are infallible, especially when fame and money are involved. Denver, like so many others, put trust in a machine, in a process, in people. That trust was betrayed. In unraveling the truth, what also emerges is a strange kind of vindication, not just for Denver, but for those who always believed there was more to the story. The friends who insisted he would never be so careless. The fans who questioned the official reports. The aviation enthusiasts who studied the crash again and again. They were right to be skeptical. The truth was waiting, buried beneath years of misdirection and silence. Even now, the emotional weight of the revelation is heavy. Denver's death was not just a loss to music, but to the human spirit. He sang about beauty, about belonging, about a world where people cared for one another and the planet. To learn that he died because someone didn't care enough to do the right thing feels like a betrayal, not just of him, but of everything he stood for. And yet, in this painful truth, there is also a call to action, to improve transparency in aviation, to demand better oversight in aircraft sales and maintenance, to listen more closely when something doesn't add up, to honor John Denver not only with tributes and nostalgia, but with systemic changes that could save lives. The uncovering of the real cause behind John Denver's plane crash stirred more than closure. It ignited a storm of deeper questions about aviation culture, private aircraft oversight, and the dangerous assumptions made when familiarity is mistaken for safety. The revelation peeled back a facade, exposing not only the flaws in the chain of events that led to the crash, but also the broader ecosystem that enabled it to happen. While Denver's death seems sudden and singular, its roots lay in a tangled web of procedural shortcuts, systemic weaknesses, and a silent, dangerous trust in the unchecked. The Rutan Long EZ, the model Denver flew that day, was never designed with the casual hobbyist in mind. It was an aircraft that demanded understanding, not just of aviation principles, but of mechanical quirks, real-time adjustments, and personalized modifications. These types of aircraft often attract seasoned enthusiasts who enjoy the thrill of hands-on flying and maintenance. But therein lies a critical flaw. They fall into regulatory gray zones. While certified aircraft go through layers of inspections and approvals, experimental aircraft are largely the responsibility of the owner-builder. This creates a culture of independence, but also isolation. It fosters environments where technical improvisation becomes common and where dangerous modifications are sometimes passed off as clever tweaks. Denver wasn't involved in the building of the aircraft. He was its owner, but not its engineer. He was placed into a system that assumed a pilot would be fully aware of every aspect of a plane's construction, something unrealistic for someone who had only recently acquired it. That assumption became fatal. It wasn't only the fuel valve placement that doomed the flight. It was a mindset that prioritized speed and ownership over methodical transition and accountability. The people surrounding the sale of the aircraft failed to bridge the gap between technical complexity and operational safety. Denver reportedly received minimal orientation on the aircraft's peculiarities. Crucial instructions were either vaguely communicated or omitted entirely. The pre-flight checklist, if any existed in formal documentation, was not standardized. There was no enforced requirement for a transition flight or mentorship with someone familiar with that specific plane's configuration. It was as if the plane was handed to him like a gift, with no warning about the potential poison hidden inside. This kind of laxity is more common in private aviation circles than most realize. The public often envisions air travel as rigidly safe and governed by strict law, but that image applies more accurately to commercial aviation. Private and experimental aviation, while still subject to regulations, often operate in looser frameworks. Aircraft owners routinely make judgment calls, both mechanical and procedural, based on experience rather than standardized protocol. These informal habits can be harmless, until they aren't. John Denver's tragic accident has now been reframed not as a personal lapse, but as a systemic failure. One aspect rarely discussed in detail is the psychological pressure placed on high-profile individuals who delve into technical hobbies. Denver's public image was one of gentle enthusiasm, but privately he was known to be ambitious and meticulous. When he took on flying, it wasn't a lark. He had a real passion for it. Yet being famous often creates a dangerous blind spot. Others hesitate to question decisions or enforce caution for fear of seeming disrespectful or obstructionist. There were people around Denver who sensed the plane might not be a good match for him, but the culture of deference surrounding celebrities meant those concerns were quieted or dismissed. When you're John Denver, you don't just fly a plane, you trust others to trust you. That social dynamic created a vacuum where doubts were whispered but never acted upon. The pressure to appear confident, capable, and independent can suppress necessary caution. It's a reminder that in technical disciplines, no level of fame can substitute for rigor and oversight. Another underexplored component of the mystery's resolution is the legal structure that allowed the aircraft to be sold in the first place. The shell company involved in the sale had no visible assets, no meaningful accountability, and was structured to vanish after its transactional role was complete. It existed on paper only, shielding the individuals behind it from consequence. The use of such entities is common in industries involving liability, boats, cars, even buildings, but in aviation, where lives are at direct stake, this becomes far more dangerous. It begs the question, should there be greater regulations surrounding the sale of experimental aircraft? Currently, it's easier to transfer ownership of a plane like the Long EZ than it is to sell a firearm in many jurisdictions. Buyers are often left to rely on the honesty of sellers, the completeness of logbooks, and their own ability to inspect a machine they didn't build. This lack of mandatory independent review or mechanical audit is shocking, especially when the consequences of a flaw are so definitive. John Denver's case now becomes a rallying point. Aviation authorities under public scrutiny must reevaluate how oversight intersects with private sales. It raises the notion of mandating third-party certification for modified or heavily customized aircraft, particularly those being sold to new pilots or individuals without direct engineering involvement in the build. While the FAA has made strides since the 1990s in tracking aircraft registration and airworthiness, many of the systems in place still lean heavily on self-reporting and voluntary compliance. Denver's death exposes the peril of such reliance. What also becomes clear is how the memory of an event, once enshrined in public consciousness, can obscure the truth. For nearly 3 decades, the story told was simple. A singer flew a quirky plane and ran out of fuel. The ending was tragic, but the arc seemed comprehensible. Now, with the facts in the open, that story collapses. Denver didn't just run out of fuel. He was placed in a scenario where the tools to manage that fuel were inaccessible. He wasn't ignorant, he was set up to fail. This shift in narrative matters profoundly. When we rewrite a person's last moments, we rewrite the lens through which they are remembered. There's also something unsettling in how the crash was originally investigated. Despite his fame, Denver's case did not receive the forensic depth that might have uncovered these truths sooner. The NTSB's initial report was technical but narrow, focused on cockpit behavior rather than forensic engineering. Investigators at the time lacked full access to the aircraft's background, and there was no pressing legal incentive to uncover wrongdoing. With no lawsuits filed, and the aircraft's seller legally insulated, the deeper inquiry simply never came. This introduces another broader concern. How many other fatal crashes have been similarly misunderstood or inaccurately explained? The failure to detect deceit in Denver's case wasn't due to a lack of tools. It was due to a lack of suspicion. The assumption of good faith in the transfer of a vehicle with that level of technical nuance proved fatal. If anything, Denver's celebrity may have hindered a deeper probe. Authorities may have sought to simplify the explanation, consciously or unconsciously, to move quickly past the optics of a high-profile death. This tendency to avoid complexity in the face of public tragedy is understandable, but dangerous. The pursuit of truth must be exhaustive, especially when the person involved is known to millions. Even as the technical story has reached its conclusion, the emotional fallout from this truth ripples outward. Denver's family, fans, and peers now carry a very different sense of what happened that day. Grief shaped by confusion has given way to grief shaped by betrayal. While time may have dulled the raw pain, the knowledge that he died not by chance, but through systemic collapse, introduces a second wave of loss. Mourning now mingles with outrage, disbelief, and a desire for reform. There is also a larger cultural conversation that emerges. John Denver was a figure associated with gentleness, harmony, and idealism. That he fell victim to something as cold and calculated as mechanical neglect and legal evasion is jarring. It speaks to the way even the most wholesome figures can be ensnared by systems that prioritize expediency over human life. His story now intersects with broader themes of aviation safety, of regulatory reform, of the tension between freedom and responsibility in experimental flight. In response to the revelation, several aviation groups have already begun discussing changes in protocol. While no legislation has yet been passed in direct response, the push for better transparency in aircraft modifications is growing. Grassroots movements within the aviation community, especially those involved in home-built aircraft, are calling for improved documentation standards, mandatory disclosure of modifications, and pre-sale safety assessments. These shifts may start small, but they carry the seeds of long-term change. Change rooted in the painful clarity that comes from hindsight. Denver's death, long seen as an unfortunate blip, now becomes a catalyst. Pilots who build or modify aircraft must confront the weight of their responsibility. Buyers must be empowered with tools to verify what they're getting. And perhaps most importantly, those responsible for enforcement must recognize that tragedy is often born not of a single error, but of an invisible accumulation of overlooked truths. There's a poetic irony in all of this. John Denver, the man who sang so often about the beauty of flight, the wonder of the open sky, the peace found in remote places, was taken by a machine that lied to him. A machine that should have symbolized his passion became the instrument of his silence. That irony is not just sad, it is instructive. It teaches us to look more closely, to ask more questions, to never assume safety just because it's stamped in a logbook. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us? What are your thoughts on the mystery finally being solved? What do you expect happened? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.